Jesus taught how to pray correctly and be truly heard by God. There is a quiet question that lives inside almost every believer, a question people rarely say out loud but feel every time they close their eyes to pray. Why does it seem so easy for some people to talk to God, while for others the silence feels endless? Why do you pour out your heart with sincerity, hoping for a sign, a whisper, even a small sense of reassurance, yet all you feel is stillness? And if God already knows your pain, your need, your fear, then why does prayer sometimes feel like a conversation where only one side is speaking? These questions linger not because you lack faith, but because no one ever sat with you and taught you what Jesus actually showed his disciples. Not the words, not the formulas, but the posture of heart that makes heaven lean close. Think about the moments that shaped your own life of prayer. The late-night whispers when worry kept you awake. The desperate pleas when everything around you felt fragile. The quiet requests you offered on days you didn't want anyone to see you breaking inside. In those moments, did you ever wonder, Lord, are you hearing me? Is something wrong with the way I pray? You are not alone. Millions of believers carry that same unspoken fear, the fear that their prayers are somehow missing God's attention. And yet, when we look at the life of Jesus, we see a completely different experience of prayer, one marked not by strain, but by relationship, not by uncertainty, but by alignment, not by distance, but by communion. What if the silence you've been interpreting as abandonment was actually an invitation into a deeper understanding? What if the way you've been taught to pray is sincere, but incomplete? What if Jesus didn't just come to save you, but to teach you how to speak to the Father in a way that brings clarity instead of confusion, peace instead of panic, confidence instead of hesitation? What if the problem has never been that God is not listening, but that no one ever showed you how to approach him? The way his son did? Imagine something for a moment. Imagine Jesus sitting beside you, not as a distant figure in Scripture, but as someone who knows your fears, your questions, your longings. Imagine him saying, "Come, let me show you how to pray." Not with pressure, not with complicated rituals, not with the weight of religious expectation, but with the simplicity of someone who knows he is always heard. Imagine him teaching you not how to recite words, but how to posture your heart. Not how to perform, but how to connect. Not how to strive, but how to rest. What if prayer was never supposed to feel like you were trying to get God's attention? What if true prayer begins the moment you stop trying to prove something to him and instead allow yourself to be seen by him? What if the feeling of distance has nothing to do with God stepping away and everything to do with learning how to step into the relationship Jesus had with the Father? You might be asking yourself, why does my prayer feel heavy? Why does it feel like I'm always reaching but never receiving? Why does my heart feel unheard even when I'm doing everything I know how to do? These questions are not signs of spiritual failure. They are signs of spiritual hunger. They are signs that something inside you already knows there is more to prayer than what you've been practicing. Something inside you senses that Jesus prayed differently, and you want to understand why. Today, you are going to see prayer from a new angle, not through the lens of pressure or performance, but through the eyes of Jesus himself. You are going to discover that the way he prayed is not hidden, not complicated, and not reserved for a select few. It is woven through the Gospels, waiting for the heart that is ready to see it. And when you begin to understand the posture Jesus carried into every moment of prayer, something inside you will shift. The confusion will lift. The doubt will weaken. The sense of distance will shrink. And prayer will stop feeling like something you are trying to master and start feeling like the relationship it was always meant to be. Stay with me. Because if your heart has ever wondered whether God truly hears you, the answer is not only yes. The answer is that Jesus came to show you how to pray in a way that makes that yes unmistakably clear. The human struggle with prayer. There is a part of your heart that has learned to pray through disappointment. You may not admit it openly, but you feel it every time you bow your head. A quiet hesitation, a subtle fear, a voice that whispers, "What if nothing happens again?" Most Christians carry this silent tension. They believe God is real. They believe He listens, yet deep inside they wonder why their own prayers seem to disappear into the air. And if you've ever asked yourself, "Why do I pray and nothing changes?" you are not wrestling with doubt. You are wrestling with a wound that has never been acknowledged. Think back to the moments when prayer felt like your only option, when the doctor's words left you shaking, when someone you loved slipped away from your life, when anxiety gripped your chest so tightly you could barely breathe. When you whispered to God in the dark, hoping for some sign, some reassurance, some sense that He was near. You didn't just want an answer. You wanted to know you were not alone. You wanted to know that heaven was closer than your fear. But the silence that followed didn't comfort you. It confused you. It made you wonder whether you were doing something wrong. And this is where the struggle gets heavier. Because when people around you talk about breakthroughs, miracles, and answered prayers, something inside you feels left out. You smile, you nod, you celebrate with them. But privately you wonder why your own story seems filled with waiting and unanswered questions. You wonder why your whispered prayers echo back with no apparent response. You wonder if God is listening to everyone except you. And although you rarely say it out loud, your heart carries the weight of that question everywhere you go. There's another layer to this struggle, the difference between how you pray publicly and how you pray privately. In public, you know the right words. You know how to sound confident, grateful, faithful, but in private, when it's just you and God, the polished words disappear. What comes out is raw, honest, sometimes shaking, sometimes angry, sometimes unsure. And you might even wonder if those prayers count, or if God prefers the cleaner versions people offer in church. But Jesus knew exactly what private prayers looked like. He knew the trembling, He knew the weakness, He knew the tears that fall before you can form a sentence, and He never despised that kind of prayer. In fact, He taught that such vulnerability is the doorway into the Father's heart. Still, unanswered prayer does something deep to a person. It shapes identity in ways most people never talk about. If you pray and nothing happens, you start to believe the silence says something about you, that maybe your faith is too weak, maybe your past disqualifies you, maybe God speaks to everyone else but you. And slowly, without noticing it, prayer becomes something you do with caution instead of confidence, with fear instead of expectation, with uncertainty instead of trust. But what if this painful struggle is not evidence of God's absence, but evidence of how deeply you long for Him? What if the ache you feel is proof that your soul was made for more than distant, mechanical prayer? What if the questions inside you are not signs of spiritual immaturity, but invitations to rediscover prayer the way Jesus taught it? Because here's a truth you may have never been told. Feeling unheard doesn't mean God is ignoring you. Feeling uncertain doesn't mean you're praying wrong. Feeling frustrated doesn't mean your faith is failing. These emotions simply reveal a heart that wants real connection, not just routine. And that longing is holy. You are not the only one who has felt heaven's silence and wondered what it meant. You are not the only one who tries to pray with sincerity, yet feels unsure afterward. You are not the only one who has walked out of a church service feeling more confused about prayer than when you walked in. Millions of believers carry this hidden struggle, but few stop to ask the deeper question. Did Jesus ever intend prayer to feel this way? What if your struggle is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but a sign that you are ready to learn the way Jesus truly prayed? What if the heaviness you've been carrying is about to lift, because you will finally understand what no one ever explained to you? And what if the frustration you've felt for years is about to be replaced with clarity, intimacy, and confidence? Because the moment you Understand how Jesus approached the Father. The way you see prayer will change forever. Jesus breaks the expectation. If you've ever felt unsure about the way you pray, you need to understand something profound. Even the disciples who walked beside Jesus, watched his miracles, and heard his teachings firsthand, eventually reached a moment when they realized they didn't know how to pray. They didn't ask, "Teach us how to preach." They didn't ask, "Teach us how to perform miracles." They asked, "Lord, teach us to pray." That single request reveals something important. They saw a difference between the prayers they had been raised with and the way Jesus prayed, and they were humble enough to admit it. Most prayer in Jesus' day followed a predictable pattern, loud, repetitive, formulaic, designed to be heard by others. People believed that the more elaborate the words, the more likely God would listen. They believed volume and repetition equaled spiritual power. They believed ritual was the key to getting God's attention. It was prayer shaped by culture, tradition, and expectation. In other words, it looked very similar to the pressure many Christians still feel today. But Jesus, in his quiet and simple way, challenged all of it. He didn't criticize prayer itself. He didn't discourage people from seeking God. He didn't shame anyone who was trying their best. Instead, he confronted the approach. He confronted the belief that God needed to be impressed. He confronted the idea that prayer had to be performed. He confronted the assumption that more words meant more power. And he did it with a simplicity that caught everyone off guard. When he said, "Do not pray like the others do," he wasn't trying to distance people from God. He was trying to remove the barriers that made God feel distant. You may not realize it, but many of the expectations you carry into prayer today are the same ones Jesus overturned. The pressure to sound spiritual, the belief that you must use the right phrases, the fear of saying something wrong, the idea that God responds only to polished, confident prayer, the feeling that your heart must be perfect before you approach him. Jesus dismantled every one of those assumptions. He wanted his followers to understand that prayer is not a performance to be perfected, but a relationship to be entered. Think for a moment about what Jesus did when he prayed. He withdrew. He quieted himself. He positioned his heart. He spoke with simplicity. He prayed with full assurance that the Father heard him before a single word left his lips. There was no competition, no pressure, no need to prove anything. There was only intimacy. And that intimacy is what his disciples longed for. It's what your heart longs for too. Because deep down, you don't want to pray to impress God. You want to pray to experience God. The most surprising part is that Jesus didn't come to create a new religious system of prayer. He came to return prayer to its original essence. He came to break the expectation that prayer must be complex. He came to break the expectation that prayer must sound holy. He came to break the expectation that you must earn the right to be heard. He came to show that prayer begins not with performance, but with authenticity, not with noise, but with alignment, not with striving, but with surrender. You might be wondering, if Jesus broke the expectations of prayer in his day, what expectations is he trying to break in mine? Maybe it's the belief that God is far away. Maybe it's the belief that your struggles disqualify you. Maybe it's the belief that God only listens to the spiritually strong. Maybe it's the belief that you need to fix yourself before you approach him. Jesus confronts those beliefs with the same authority he used 2,000 years ago. His message hasn't changed. God is not moved by performance. He is moved by honesty, humility, and trust. And here is where everything begins to shift. When Jesus corrected his disciples, he wasn't rebuking them. He was inviting them into a new kind of prayer, inviting them into a deeper way of approaching the Father, inviting them to leave behind the methods that made prayer feel heavy and embrace the simplicity that makes prayer feel alive. He wanted them to pray not as strangers seeking approval, but as sons and daughters who know they belong. If prayer has felt distant, complicated, or confusing, the reason might be simpler than you think. You may have been taught to pray in ways Jesus never intended, but once you see how Jesus approached the Father, those expectations begin to fall away. You begin to see prayer not as an obligation, but as a lifeline, not as a ritual, but as a conversation, and not as something reserved for the spiritually elite, but as something meant for you. Stay with me, because the next part reveals the heart of Jesus' prayer life, the internal postures that made his communion with the Father unshakable. The 3 internal postures Jesus modeled. If you've ever wondered why Jesus prayed with such clarity, such confidence, and such unshakable peace, the answer is not found in the words he used, but in the posture of his heart. Long before he taught his disciples what to pray, he demonstrated how to approach the Father. And if you look closely at the moments surrounding his prayers, you begin to see a pattern, not of technique, but of internal positioning. These quiet postures shaped every conversation he had with God, and they can shape yours as well. The first posture Jesus carried was surrender before words. Think about how often we come to God overwhelmed, tense, scattered, carrying the weight of our fears into prayer as if we need to solve everything in a single moment. Jesus never approached the Father this way. Before speaking, he aligned his heart. Before requesting, he released control. He wasn't praying to make something happen. He was praying from a place where he had already entrusted everything into the Father's hands. That act of surrender wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was the freedom of knowing that God's will is wiser than our desperation. And without this posture, prayer becomes a frantic search for answers rather than a place of rest. Ask yourself honestly, how often do you pray from panic rather than from peace? How different would your prayers feel if your first step was surrender, not striving? The second posture Jesus modeled was stillness before petition. This is the part we overlook most. Before every major moment in his ministry, he withdrew from the noise, not because he was escaping responsibility, but because he understood that clarity comes in silence. Stillness wasn't an absence of action, it was preparation for divine alignment. Jesus wasn't trying to impress God, he was listening. He was centering himself on the Father's heart so that whatever he did next flowed from intention, not impulse. But most of us enter prayer with a storm inside us. Our thoughts race. Our worries pile up. We speak before we settle. And then we wonder why we can't sense God. What if part of the reason prayer feels so heavy is because we rush into words without giving our minds space to quiet? Stillness doesn't mean inactivity. It means creating room for God to speak. When was the last time you allowed silence to lead you into prayer instead of filling the silence with your fear? The third posture Jesus carried was confidence before asking, not arrogance, not entitlement. The confidence of someone who knows he is loved, heard, and welcomed. Jesus never approached the Father as a beggar, hoping for mercy. He approached him as a son, anchored in relationship. That confidence was not based on his performance, but on his identity. And this is where many believers struggle. They pray as if they must convince God to listen. They approach him with hesitation, unsure if their words carry weight. Jesus showed us something completely different. When you know who you are to God, your voice becomes steady, your heart becomes peaceful, and your request becomes an expression of trust rather than fear. Confidence in prayer isn't about bold phrasing. It's about remembering that you are coming to your Father, not pleading before a distant deity. These 3 postures, surrender, stillness, and confidence, changed everything about the way Jesus prayed. They allowed him to enter prayer not as someone hoping for connection, but as someone already living in it. And the most incredible part is that he didn't keep this way of praying hidden. He wanted his followers to understand that prayer begins inside the heart long before it reaches the lips. Consider how these postures could reshape your own prayer life. Imagine entering prayer not weighed down by pressure, but anchored in surrender. Imagine beginning with stillness, letting your mind settle enough to sense God's nearness. Imagine asking with the confidence of someone who knows that God listens, not reluctantly but lovingly. These postures don't make prayer easier, they make it truer. They shift prayer from an act of desperation to an act of communion. If you've ever felt that your prayers lack direction or strength, this may be the shift you've been waiting for. Jesus wasn't giving us a formula. He was revealing a way of being in God's presence. And once you begin praying from these internal postures, something remarkable happens. Prayer stops feeling like a task and begins to feel like a place where you are held, understood, and heard. And now that you understand the postures that shaped Jesus' communion with the Father, the next step is seeing the divine order he followed, the sequence that brings clarity to every prayer you will ever pray. The divine order of prayer Jesus used. When you watch the rhythm of Jesus' life closely, you begin to notice something subtle but transformative about the way he prayed. His prayers were not random, they were not rushed, they were not reactions to fear or pressure. They followed an internal order, a spiritual sequence that shaped every moment he spent with the Father. And once you understand this order, prayer stops feeling chaotic and begins to feel like a path, one that Jesus walked ahead of you so you could follow with confidence. This isn't a formula, it's a flow. A movement of the heart that aligns you with God in a way that changes how you speak, how you listen, and how you walk away from prayer afterward. Everything begins with approach. Before Jesus said anything, before he asked, before he made a request, he entered the Father's presence with surrender. This wasn't the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of relationship. He approached God not with frantic energy, but with reverence. Not with a heart trying to prove something, but with a heart that trusted the Father's character. Think about how often we rush into prayer carrying fear like baggage, speaking out of urgency rather than trust. Jesus approached the Father with the assurance that God was already near, already listening, already aware. The way you approach determines the atmosphere of your entire prayer. When your heart enters with surrender instead of panic, prayer becomes a refuge instead of a struggle. Ask yourself, how often do you take a breath and actually approach God with intention before you speak? The next movement is alignment. This part of prayer is where Jesus placed his heart under the Father's will. You hear it when he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Not as a last resort, but as a posture he carried. Alignment is where fear begins to lose its grip. It's where confusion quiets. It's where you stop trying to control the outcome and start trusting the one who sees beyond what you can understand. Most believers skip this part. They jump from approaching God straight into asking him to fix something. But alignment changes everything because it positions your desires within God's wisdom. It prepares your heart to ask with clarity instead of desperation. And it opens your spiritual ears to hear what the Father is already doing in your life. Without alignment, prayer becomes a list. With alignment, prayer becomes relational guidance. Then comes agreement. This is the part of prayer that feels like partnership. Once Jesus aligned his heart with the Father's will, he prayed in agreement with what God was revealing. Agreement is not passive acceptance, it is active participation. It is speaking with faith, not because you are trying to make something happen, but because you recognize what God is already moving toward. Agreement means you are no longer praying from fear or uncertainty. You are praying from discernment. You are praying from a place where your heart and God's heart are flowing in the same direction. Many believers pray from a distance, hoping God will catch their words. Agreement is the moment prayer becomes united with heaven's intention. And when you pray from agreement, your spirit senses the shift immediately. You feel grounded, you feel focused, you feel connected to something larger than yourself. The final movement is action. Not action that tries to replace God's work, but action that reflects trust in what you just prayed. When Jesus prayed, he didn't walk away hoping something might happen. He walked forward expecting the Father to move. His actions carried the imprint of his prayer. This is where many people unintentionally sabotage their own faith. They pray with hope, but they live afterward with doubt. They ask God for peace, then continue to feed the thoughts that steal their peace. They ask God for guidance, then walk in circles because they fear making the wrong step. Action isn't about forcing a result. It's about living as someone who believes God heard you. It is the outward expression of inward trust. This divine order, approach, alignment, agreement, action, creates a prayer life that is steady, focused, and deeply connected. It keeps your heart from drifting into confusion. It replaces panic with purpose. It turns prayer into a conversation rather than a transaction. And when you begin to practice this order intentionally, you will notice something remarkable. Your prayers will feel clearer. Your mind will feel calmer. Your spirit will feel more connected to God. Not because you prayed perfectly, but because you prayed the way Jesus modeled. If prayer has ever felt scattered, heavy, or uncertain, this sequence may be the structure your heart has been missing. And once you begin to pray with this order, you will understand why Jesus prayed with such clarity and peace. Now that we've uncovered this blueprint, the next question is just as important. Why do so many believers still feel unheard, even when they pray with sincerity? Why many believers are not heard? There comes a moment in every believer's life when the question becomes unavoidable. If God is loving, if he is near, if he hears every whisper of the heart, then why does prayer sometimes feel like speaking into empty space? Why can someone pray with tears streaming down their face and still walk away feeling untouched, unheard, unchanged? These moments are painful, and for many people they become turning points in their faith. Not because they stop believing in God, but because they start doubting themselves. They begin to wonder if something inside them is broken, if their prayers are flawed, if heaven has somehow closed its doors to their voice. But the struggle is often not where people think it is. Most believers learn to pray through the lens of anxiety. Not intentionally, but because life pushes them into prayer only after everything else has failed. The heart comes trembling, racing, overwhelmed, trying to find God while drowning in fear. And while God is compassionate to that fear, anxiety creates so much internal noise that it becomes difficult to sense his nearness. Anxiety is not sin, but it is a terrible guide. It scrambles your thoughts, distorts your expectations, and makes you believe that silence is rejection. When Jesus prayed, he didn't approach the Father from a storm of panic. He approached from a place of quiet trust, which allowed him to hear what the Father was doing. Many believers have never been taught how to pause long enough for their hearts to settle before they speak. And without that, prayer becomes a cry for rescue rather than a moment of relationship. Another reason so many prayers feel unheard is that people approach God not as partners in his will, but as desperate souls hoping to escape their circumstances. They ask God to intervene, but they never slow down enough to receive direction. They plead for solutions, but resist the stillness required to hear God's wisdom. They pray for doors to open, but walk away before God can show them which one leads to peace. Prayer becomes an emergency exit instead of a place of alignment, and when the heart treats prayer as a quick escape, it becomes difficult to recognize the subtle ways God actually responds, not because he isn't speaking, but because the heart is too weary, too rushed, too frantic to perceive his voice. There is also a hidden struggle many believers never talk about. People repeat words they were taught without letting their heart speak honestly. They recite phrases, verses, and familiar patterns, hoping the repetition will move heaven. But Jesus never taught that more words equal more power. Many believers have learned to pray with their minds, but not with their hearts. They speak out of habit, not connection, and then they wonder why their prayers feel hollow. God is not impressed by polished language. He listens to sincerity. He listens to faith. He listens to the raw cry of a soul that simply wants Him. But when prayer becomes performance, the heart becomes distant, and the person walks away believing that God is distant too. The most painful misunderstanding of all is the belief that unanswered prayer means God is displeased. Many believers carry this quiet guilt, the fear that their mistakes or weaknesses have somehow silenced heaven. They believe God listens to people who are stronger, holier, more consistent. They believe they must earn the right to be heard. But Jesus never reinforced this idea. In fact, He spent His ministry drawing near to those who felt unworthy. The problem is not that God refuses to listen. The problem is that believers often interpret delayed answers as divine silence instead of divine timing. Ask yourself something honestly. How often do you pray expecting God to respond in the way you imagine? How often do you walk away disappointed when the answer doesn't arrive according to your timeline or your understanding? How often do you assume God is silent when, in reality, He is guiding you through circumstances rather than words? When your heart attaches to a specific outcome, it becomes blind to the ways God is already moving. Prayer stops being partnership and becomes pressure, and pressure suffocates faith. The truth is that many believers are not unheard. They are simply unaware of how God responds. They are waiting for fireworks while God is whispering in the quiet moments of conviction, alignment, redirection, and peace. They are looking for immediate solutions while God is building inner strength. They are asking for relief while God is shaping their character. They are begging for open doors while God is guiding their steps slowly, gently, intentionally. If prayer has ever felt unanswered in your life, it is not because heaven turned away. It is because God is leading you into a deeper understanding of how He speaks and moves. And once you begin to see prayer the way Jesus did, not as panic, not as performance, but as connection, you will realize that God has heard you every single time. Now that we've uncovered why so many believers feel unheard, the next step is understanding a truth Jesus spoke that changes everything about prayer. What it really means when He said, "Your Father knows what you need before you ask." What Jesus really meant by, "Your Father knows what you need." There is a sentence Jesus spoke that many believers quote, yet few truly understand. Your Father knows what you need before you ask. For some, it brings comfort. For others, it raises confusion. If God already knows, then why pray? If He sees the pain, the longing, the fear, the unanswered questions, then why must we still speak? And if He knows everything, why does prayer sometimes feel like we are trying to convince Him to care? These silent questions follow people into their prayer closets, into their late-night moments of worry, into the quiet spaces where they wrestle with God's timing and their own expectations. But Jesus didn't speak these words to minimize prayer. He spoke them to free you from a burden you were never meant to carry. When Jesus said the Father already knows your needs, He wasn't saying your voice is unnecessary. He was saying your desperation is unnecessary. He was removing the pressure to pray as if God must be informed, convinced, or persuaded. Many believers pray as though God is distant and inattentive, as though they need to explain their situation in detail just to be noticed. But Jesus is reminding you that before you ever kneel, before you can form a single sentence, before your fear even rises into words, the Father is already aware. Not just aware intellectually, but aware with compassion, aware with intention, aware with the heart of someone who has already begun moving in your story long before you prayed. So then, why pray? Because prayer is not about transferring information. Prayer is where your heart is transformed. Prayer is where your desires are refined, your fear is quieted, your faith is strengthened, and your relationship with God becomes real. Prayer is not the moment God begins to work. Prayer is the moment you begin to see the work He is already doing. And that changes everything. When you think of prayer as informing God, silence feels like rejection. When you think of prayer as aligning with God, silence becomes an invitation to listen. There is something else Jesus was exposing. Many people approach prayer as a negotiation. They speak as if they are trying to earn a blessing, bargain for protection, or perform well enough to deserve an answer. They pray as if God only gives when He is convinced. But Jesus removes that heavy mentality in one sentence. If the Father already knows your need, then He is not waiting on your performance. He is waiting on your trust. He is waiting on your surrender. He is waiting on you to release control long enough for Him to move without resistance. Prayer is not you working for God's attention. Prayer is you stepping into the awareness that you already have His attention. Think about what this means for your life. Every fear you have brought to God, He knew. Every tear you cried alone, He saw. Every moment you prayed without feeling anything in return, He heard with tenderness, knowing exactly what your heart needed, whether you could express it or not. When Jesus said, "Your Father knows what you need," He was assuring you that God is not learning about your pain as you speak it. He is meeting you in it. He is providing wisdom beyond what you can perceive. He is shaping strength you didn't know you were developing. He is preparing doors you haven't seen yet. Prayer simply postures your heart to recognize those things. There is also a deeper truth hidden beneath Jesus' words. Often what we think we need is not what God knows we need. We pray for relief when God is building resilience. We ask for escape when God is creating endurance. We pray for answers while God is creating spiritual maturity. We seek immediate comfort when God is establishing long-term healing. Because the Father knows your need more fully than you do, His response may look different than your request. But different is not denial. Different is protection. Different is wisdom. Different is love. When your heart grasps this truth, prayer changes. Instead of begging God to see you, you begin thanking Him because He already does. Instead of praying from anxiety, you pray from assurance. Instead of trying to force an outcome, you begin resting in His timing. Instead of wondering why He feels silent, you begin noticing how He is guiding you in ways quieter than words. Ask yourself honestly, how many times have you assumed God was ignoring you, when in reality He was shielding you from something you didn't understand? How often have you walked away from prayer disappointed because God didn't answer the way you expected, not realizing His protection was already surrounding you? How often have you confused delay with distance, not knowing that God was preparing something greater than your request? Jesus didn't give this teaching to create mystery. He gave it to remove fear. You were never meant to pray as someone unsure of their Father's heart. You were meant to pray knowing that every word you speak rests in the hands of someone who knew your need long before you could express it. Someone who responds not only to your voice, but to your vulnerability. Someone who hears you even when you have no words left. Now that your heart understands this truth, you are ready to see the next revelation, the moment prayer shifts from routine into intimacy, from practice into relationship. The moment where prayer becomes relationship. There is a turning point in every believer's prayer life, a moment when prayer stops being something you do and becomes a place where you belong. Most people never reach this shift because they were taught to approach prayer as an obligation, a discipline, or a religious habit, rather than an intimate exchange between a child and a father. But Jesus came to reveal something deeper. He came to show that prayer is not a task to accomplish. It is the space where your soul finally breathes. And until you understand this, prayer will always feel heavier than it should. Think about the last time you prayed with complete honesty, No filters, no rehearsed phrases, no pretending to be stronger than you felt. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was grief, maybe it was the moment you whispered, "God, I don't know what to do anymore." In that moment, you weren't performing, you weren't trying to sound spiritual, you weren't trying to say the right words, you were being real. And what you may not realize is that honesty is what transforms prayer into relationship. God is not drawn to polished prayer. He's drawn to the authentic cry of a heart that wants him more than it wants the answers. Jesus showed us this repeatedly. When he prayed in solitude, he didn't hide his anguish. When he prayed before the cross, his words were raw and trembling. When he prayed for his disciples, his heart was on full display. Jesus never approached the Father with emotional distance. He approached with vulnerability. And this is what many believers miss. The power of prayer is not found in saying the perfect thing. The power of prayer is found in bringing the real you into God's presence. Relationship begins where performance ends. There is another layer to this shift. Relationship in prayer takes form the moment you stop talking at God and begin talking with him. Many believers pray as if God is far away, sitting somewhere in heaven, analyzing their words from a distance. They speak and speak, then stand up and walk away without ever creating space for God to respond. But Jesus modeled something completely different. He withdrew not only to speak, but to listen. He treated prayer as a dialogue, not a monologue. And that is what made his relationship with the Father alive. When was the last time you paused long enough for God to speak to your heart? When was the last time silence in prayer felt like presence instead of absence? For prayer to become relationship, something else must happen too. You must bring your whole self into the moment. Not just your needs, but your joys. Not just your fears, but your gratitude. Not just your requests, but your affection. Many people pray as if God only wants to hear their emergencies. But a Father who loves you doesn't want fragments of your heart. He wants all of it. Every detail, every worry, every longing. And when you begin to share your heart with him beyond the crises, prayer becomes a place of connection, not just crisis management. And then there is the most defining part of all. Relationship in prayer becomes real when you begin to sense God's nearness, not through signs or dramatic moments, but through subtle internal shifts. The peace that settles in the middle of chaos, the clarity that appears after confusion, the sudden strength that wasn't there before, the conviction that redirects your steps. These are not coincidences. They are the gentle fingerprints of God responding to your prayer. Most people miss them because they are waiting for dramatic evidence. But God often whispers because intimacy is born in quiet spaces. Ask yourself something honestly. When you pray, do you speak as someone trying to earn God's attention or as someone already deeply loved? Do you hold back your true emotions because you think they make you unworthy? Or do you allow God to meet you exactly where you are? Do you see prayer as a task to complete or as the moment where your heart reconnects with the one who formed it? The way you answer these questions reveals whether your prayer life is built on religion or relationship. But here is the most hopeful truth. No matter how distant prayer has felt in the past, no matter how many times you prayed and felt nothing, your heart is never too far gone to experience intimacy with God. The moment you choose honesty over performance, connection over repetition, presence over pressure, prayer transforms. You begin to feel held, you begin to feel known, you begin to feel the gentle reassurance that God was never far from you, not even once. This is the moment when prayer becomes relationship, when your soul stops striving and starts resting, when your words stop reaching upward and start settling into the presence of a Father who has been waiting for you. And once you taste that kind of intimacy, prayer will no longer feel like an obligation. It will feel like home. Now that your heart is positioned to experience prayer as relationship, the next step is learning a practical, simple, deeply biblical way of praying. the kind of method Jesus himself modeled that you can begin using tonight. A practical Jesus-taught method the viewer can apply tonight. Now that your heart has been softened to understand prayer as relationship rather than ritual, you are ready for something deeply practical. Something you can use tonight, in your room, in your car, in the quiet space where only you and God exist. Jesus never intended prayer to be complicated. He never intended you to feel pressured to find the right words. He intended prayer to be clear, simple, honest, and transformative. And the method he modeled is not hidden. It is woven through his teachings, through his solitude, through his moments before miracles, and through the way he surrendered to the Father. This method isn't a formula that forces God's hand, but a rhythm that positions your heart to hear him and walk with him. The first movement is to enter with worship, not worry. This doesn't mean singing songs or reciting phrases. It means shifting your focus. Before you speak about what you need, take a moment to remember who God is. Not because he needs the reminder, but because your heart does. When you begin prayer by acknowledging God's character, your fear starts to shrink. Your breathing steadies. Your thoughts begin to settle. Instead of approaching God as someone overwhelmed by life, you begin approaching him as someone anchored in his presence. And in that moment, you stop praying from panic and start praying from perspective. Try it. Before you say anything else, whisper, "Father, you are here." Those 4 words can shift the entire atmosphere of your prayer. The second movement is to speak truth before need. When Jesus prayed, "Your kingdom come, your will be done," he wasn't reciting a religious line. He was establishing alignment. Before bringing his request, he brought his heart. He surrendered his desires to the wisdom of the Father. This step is where clarity begins to form inside you. Speak truth about your situation, not the anxious thoughts that overwhelm you, but the reality that God is in control, that he is wiser, that his plans are higher. This is where you release the illusion of control. This is where you stop trying to make God see things your way and begin trusting that his way is already leading you toward peace. When you speak truth before need, fear loses its authority over your prayer. The third movement is to present your request clearly and humbly. Jesus never taught that you must hide your needs or pretend you are strong. He welcomed honesty. He welcomed tears. He welcomed the trembling voice of someone who has reached the end of their own strength. Your request doesn't need to be poetic. It doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be real. Speak your need plainly, without dressing it up. Tell God exactly what is weighing on you, exactly where you feel lost, exactly what you hope for. He is not moved by eloquence. He is moved by sincerity. The moment you present your request honestly, you open the door for God to meet you where you truly are, not where you pretend to be. The fourth movement is to release the outcome into God's hands. This may be the hardest part, but it is the moment where prayer becomes faith. After Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, he surrendered the results. Not my will, but yours. He didn't surrender because he lacked desire. He surrendered because he trusted the Father's wisdom more than his own anguish. Many believers pray, but hold tightly to the outcome. They ask God for help, but cling to their own timeline, their own expectations, their own definition of what should happen. Release is where the weight lifts off your chest. Release is where you stop carrying what only God can resolve. Release is where faith becomes more than a concept. It becomes rest. The fifth movement is to remain in quiet trust afterward. Most people end their prayer too soon. They speak their need, say amen, and rush back into worry. But Jesus often stayed in solitude even after praying, not because he needed more words, but because he allowed the Father's presence to settle in his heart. Quiet trust is where anxiety dissolves. Quiet trust is where God often whispers direction, comfort, or conviction. Quiet trust doesn't require silence around you, only silence within you. This is where you consciously choose to remain in peace instead of returning to panic. Imagine applying this tonight. Imagine entering your room, turning off the lights, taking a slow breath, and approaching the Father, not as a distant deity, but as someone who already loves you. Imagine speaking truth before fear. Imagine telling him your need without filters. Imagine releasing it with the confidence that his hands are safer than yours. Imagine sitting in that presence, letting peace wash over the parts of you that have felt numb or overwhelmed. This method is not about repeating steps. It is about shaping your heart to pray the way Jesus prayed. And once you begin practicing this rhythm consistently, your prayer life will stop feeling like a struggle and start feeling like transformation. Prayer becomes the quiet space where God realigns you. Prayer becomes the place where burdens loosen. Prayer becomes the moment where you remember who you are and who He is. Now that you have a practical way to pray with depth and intimacy, the next step is to invite your heart into the kind of transformation prayer was always meant to produce, an invitation that will shift not just how you pray, but how you walk with God. The moment of invitation. There comes a point in every message, every teaching, every encounter with God, when information is no longer enough. Something deeper begins to stir. Something inside you starts to lean in, to open, to soften. This is the moment where the heart is invited, not pressured, not forced, but gently drawn into a new way of walking with God. You've learned the struggle. You've seen the misconceptions. You've discovered the internal postures Jesus carried. You've understood the divine order that shaped His prayers. You've grasped what it means that the Father already knows your needs. You've learned a simple, powerful method you can use tonight. But none of this becomes transformation until you allow your heart to step into the invitation Jesus extends. And this invitation is not complicated. It is not heavy. It is not reserved for people who seem more spiritual or more disciplined or more put together. It is for you. For the version of you who has doubted, for the version of you who has felt unheard, for the version of you who has prayed with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes. Jesus is not calling the strongest part of you. He is calling the most honest part of you, the part that longs for connection, the part that hopes for intimacy, the part that is tired of praying from fear and ready to pray from relationship. This invitation begins with the simple awareness that God has been closer to you than you realized. Every time you thought heaven was silent, He was listening. Every time you felt alone, He was near. Every time your prayer felt weak, He carried the weight you couldn't. Jesus wants you to see that prayer was never meant to be a performance. It was never meant to be a test of your spiritual worthiness. Prayer was meant to be the place where your heart comes home. And He is inviting you into that home again, without shame, without fear, without the pressure of doing it perfectly. Maybe you have prayed for years without feeling much change. Maybe you have prayed through heartbreak, disappointment, unanswered questions, and seasons where your faith felt paper thin. And yet here you are, still searching, still longing, still hoping that there is more, that longing matters. It is the sign that the Holy Spirit has been drawing you. It is the evidence that your heart is ready for something deeper. When Jesus invites you into a new kind of prayer, He's not asking you to try harder. He's asking you to come closer. This invitation is an opportunity to shift how you see yourself before God. You are not a beggar standing at the gates of heaven. You are not an outsider trying to earn your way in. You are a child speaking to your Father, a Father who already knows your needs, a Father who already sees your heart, a Father who has been waiting patiently for you to stop praying like someone who must convince Him and start praying like someone who trusts Him. That shift alone changes everything. It removes the trembling from your voice. It quiets the fear in your chest. It brings rest into places that have been tense for years. But the invitation goes even deeper. Jesus is not just calling you to pray differently, he is calling you to live differently. To carry the awareness of God's presence into your day, into your decisions, into the moments where anxiety tries to rise again. Prayer is not confined to a quiet room or a specific hour. Prayer is the continuous posture of a heart connected to God, and Jesus is inviting you to begin walking through life with the same closeness he had with the Father. Imagine waking up tomorrow and starting your day not with worry but with awareness. Imagine facing challenges not with fear but with the assurance that God is guiding your steps. Imagine ending your day not exhausted by your thoughts but held by his peace. As you hear this invitation, something in you may already be responding. Perhaps your heart feels lighter. Perhaps a sense of hope is rising. Perhaps you feel a quiet nudge, a whisper reminding you that God is not done with you, that he has been pursuing you through every unanswered prayer, every season of silence, every moment of doubt, that he has been waiting for the day you would let go of the pressure to pray perfectly and simply come to him as you are. This is that moment. The moment where your heart says, "Yes, Lord, teach me to pray." The moment where you decide that prayer will no longer be a place of fear or confusion, but a place of connection and trust. The moment where you accept the invitation to step into the kind of relationship with God that Jesus died to give you. And as this transformation begins within you, there is one final movement that will not only strengthen your spirit, but also seal this message in your heart, the closing moment where faith and action meet. You've come this far, which means something inside you is already shifting. Your heart is awake in a way it wasn't before. You've walked through your unanswered questions, your fears about being unheard, your longing for deeper connection, and the gentle revelation of how Jesus truly taught us to pray. Now you stand at the threshold of something sacred. The moment where reflection turns into response, where faith turns into movement, and where this message becomes part of your spiritual transformation rather than just another video you watched. This final moment matters. Not because of algorithms or metrics, but because it is here that your heart decides what to do with everything God has stirred inside you. You've heard truth, you've felt conviction, you've sensed invitation. Now it's time to seal it. When Jesus taught, he always guided people toward action, not action rooted in pressure, but action rooted in willingness, in desire, in surrender. And that is what this moment is for. Take a breath and think about what resonated with you most in this message. Was it the realization that God has heard every prayer you've ever whispered, even the ones spoken through tears? Was it the understanding that Jesus himself modeled surrender, stillness, and confidence before speaking a single word? Was it the revelation that your Father knows your needs before you ask and has been guiding you long before you understood how to perceive his leading? Or was it the understanding that prayer is not a performance? It is relationship, it is home, it is the quiet space where your soul finally aligns with heaven. Wherever your heart felt the deepest pull, that is where your next step begins. This is the moment where I invite you, not as a preacher speaking from a distance, but as someone walking this journey with you, to respond, not to me, but to God. Response is how faith breathes. Response is how revelation sinks deeper. Response is how transformation solidifies. And your response can begin with something incredibly simple. Speak to God now, in the way Jesus taught you. Let your heart come before your words. Let the postures of surrender, stillness, and confidence guide you. Let the divine order Jesus lived, approach, alignment, agreement, action, shape how you pray tonight. But there is also a response you can make right here, in this moment, one that strengthens your own journey and supports someone else's. When you write something publicly, When you comment with honesty or humility, you create a moment of spiritual agreement. You create an atmosphere where others feel safe to open their hearts, and you allow the message to continue reaching those who need it. That is why, if this message spoke to you, I invite you to comment these words: Lord, teach me to pray. It isn't just a sentence, it's a declaration, it's a posture. It's the very request the disciples made when they realized there was more to prayer than they ever knew. When you type it, you're not just interacting, you're aligning your heart with everything God has stirred in you during this message. And if someone comes to mind while you're listening, someone who feels spiritually dry, someone who cries out at night feeling unheard, someone who says they pray but can't feel God, share this video with them. You may be the bridge God uses to bring clarity and comfort into their life. One simple act of obedience can become the turning point in someone's spiritual journey. If you want to walk deeper into prayers like this, into teachings that help you understand God's voice, God's timing, and God's heart, then I invite you to subscribe and stay connected. Not because numbers matter, but because consistency matters, growth matters, spiritual nourishment matters. And if this message reached you today, it's because God is drawing you into something greater than what you have experienced so far. As you go from this moment, remember this: prayer is no longer a place of confusion for you. It is no longer a place where you strive, fear, or second-guess yourself. From this day forward, prayer becomes the place where you meet your Father with confidence, where you speak as someone who is heard, where you rest in the wisdom of God, and where your heart finds peace even before your circumstances change. This is not the end of the message. It is the beginning of a new way of praying, a new way of living, a new way of walking with God. And you are ready for it. If you're prepared, whisper it aloud or write it below. Lord, teach me to pray.